CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Li Jianhua. Our top stories. Sounding the alarm on artificial intelligence, Google's godfather of AI warns the technology is moving ahead too fast and will soon be smarter than humans.
For other headlines, the United States Treasury Secretary warns the country could run out of money in a month if it can't reach a deal over the debt ceiling.
Money in the bank, HSBC profits triple as higher interest rates lift earnings.
A real-life Hollywood drama starring the striking scriptwriters and a nail-biting storyline threatening to bring TV and film production to a standstill.
And days before the coronation of King Charles, what does the great British public think of the monarchy?
Computers could become smarter than humans far sooner than we think. That's the rather blunt warning from the pioneer of artificial intelligence, who says he's quit Google to speak freely about the dangers of the technology.
Geoffrey Hinton, described as the godfather of AI, announced his resignation from the tech giant, saying he regretted his work. His groundbreaking research has paved the way for current AI systems like ChatGPT. Hinton said he's worried about AI's capacity to produce convincing false images and texts, creating a world where people will not be able to know what is true anymore.
Well, let's talk to Inma Martinez, the chair of the Global Partnership on AI, an initiative bringing together AI professionals to promote human values and transparency. Inma, well, Geoffrey Hinton, widely seen as the godfather of AI, says AI chatbots are quite scary. I mean, is he right? I mean, what should we be most worried about? What does he know that we don't know?
Well, I think he's pointing out something that is really relevant, which is people should be really careful when they use digital services and digital products, because many of them today are powered by artificial intelligence. And in many instances, the people putting them in the world want to do evil things like fake news or pretending to be your voice. So I think his call onto logic and people to be aware is very important. A bit melodramatic, but it's a good point that he's making.
Are you confident that humanity really can manage all the risks associated with artificial intelligence?
This is what we are highlighting. Artificial intelligence has been in development for over 50 years. It's only that when this type of artificial intelligence and other ones were commercialized recently, some people began to use them for evil things. And we did not have proper regulation or safe rails or even educated people as to, no, that's not the Pope in a ski jacket. You know, like the common sense that comes after years and years of using technology. So I think that we are at an important, crucial moment in which governments and society in general has to come to terms with artificial intelligence is out there, but we need to ensure that it's being developed with ethics and that the products and the services that people use are safe to use.
You really would have to be a splendid optimist to think that governments around the world really will cooperate and come up with wise regulations and international agreements. I mean, they don't agree on many things at the moment.
But they do agree on important things. For example, all nations agree that human cloning should not be done. And, you know, it's happening. Or that you should not modify the DNA of babies to turn them into superhumans that only the rich can afford. There are many, many agreements globally in which governments understand that this kind of world, we cannot deal with it without any common sense, that we want a world that is fit for humans to live. And now is the turn for artificial intelligence to go through that scrutiny.
Well, you're the chair of the G7 countries, the GPAI, the Agency for the Development and Cooperation on Artificial Intelligence. I mean, how are we doing on AI regulation so far?
We are working globally on frameworks. And by the way, the GPAI is a league of 29 countries, supported also by the OECD, who has put out, principles of AI development. And across the board, every single government is working on frameworks. How do we use these systems? How they should be developed? How they should be commercialized? The data of the people, how is it being treated? And there is a plan. It's only that when ChatGPT was put in the market without any warning, it has accelerated the rhythm at which we are ensuring all of these principles and all of these guarantees for people. But they are working intensely.
Inmar, come back and talk to us again soon, unless we've both been replaced by AR for the moment. Inmar Martinez, Chair of the Global Partnership on AI, thank you very much.
Thank you.
BP has announced a $5 billion profit in the first quarter of 2023, sparking further calls for energy giants to pay more tax. That beat expects its profits of $4.3 billion as last year's surge in oil and gas prices continues to affect the bottom line. BP's dividend stayed unchanged at 6.61 cents per share after a 10% increase in February.
Food prices in the UK have risen a record amount past year. That's according to the British Retail Consortium. The group says prices have soared by almost 16%, with food inflation at its highest since the year 1977. However, the trade body says it expects prices will begin to fall in the coming months.
Germany has reported a surprise 2.4% drop in retail sales in March from the previous month, with experts expecting a slight rebound. Consumer spending is still feeling the pressure from rising prices, and the drop in sales was 8.6% year-on-year in real terms.
Australia's central bank unexpectedly raised interest rates by a quarter percentage point, sending the country's currency surging. The Reserve Bank increased its cash rate to 3.85%. That's its highest level in more than a decade.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Central Bank is meeting to weigh up its next interest rate decision. Our correspondent John Terrace is in New York. So, John, what will the Fed do?
Yes. Well, there's a tradition to this. What happens every month that the Federal Reserve, the central bank, meets to discuss interest rates, they do it in the same way. So they meet on a Tuesday, they have a nice lunch, they stay in a hotel overnight, and then on Wednesday they have another think about things and they make their decision, and then there's a news conference, and it's normally the news conference that makes all the headlines. So we're in the middle of that process now. The meeting is already underway at the central bank there in Washington, D.C. Now, we're expecting them to increase interest rates again, this time by 25 basis points, which is pretty much the minimum that they could do. Now, this comes even though we have very hot earnings coming out of Wall Street for the first quarter. We have a very strong jobs environment at the moment, even though we have thousands of tech jobs being laid off and many other industries laying people off at the same time as well. We also, though, have PCE, which is personal consumption expenditure, the Federal Reserve's favorite measure of inflation, showing signs of cooling down now. CPI and PPI, which are among the most important bits of monthly economic data, they're stabilizing now, though they're far from the 2% that the Federal Reserve desires. And of course, we have the banking issue going on with Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase, who bought First Republic yesterday, rescued it, yesterday's big story, saying that that would probably result in a reduction in the amount of loans that First Republic does going forward under JP Morgan Chase. And that is a sort of anti-inflationary thing as well. So we're expecting them to raise tomorrow by 25 basis points and then stop. And then they can either stop and restart, or stop and remain paused, or potentially, if there really is a recession at the end of the year, which many forecast, they could stop and actually cut interest rates by the end of 2023, early 2024. Now, at the moment, going into all of this, the Dow Jones is sharply down, 500 points lower, about 1.6%.
And John, is the debt ceiling looming?
Well, now, this is potentially a very serious story. Potentially. Very serious indeed. It's been ramped up here in the last 24 hours by Janet Yellen, who is the Treasury Secretary, who said yesterday, just before the close of trading on Monday, that the date at which the US is going to run out of money has been moved forward, in her view, to the 1st of June, when we all thought it would be sometime between July and September. Now, what she's talking about is the debt ceiling. This is money already spent by the Congress. It's gone. It's on the United States credit card, if you will, and if the Congress doesn't agree to increase the amount on that credit card, then the US will default on its debt, and that indeed could be very, very serious. Now, even as we speak, the Treasury is robbing Peter to pay Paul, as it were. Extraordinary measures are being used to make sure that they don't default on their debt any earlier than June the 1st. They are essentially using tax revenue that's coming in at the moment from the last year, 2022, to cover these debts, particularly with corporate tax, although the corporate tax level, I'm told, is less than they were expecting. So that's why they've advanced this date forward. It's embarrassing to even be in this position now, damaging the full faith and credit of the United States and, by extension, of course, the dollar. The country has never actually defaulted. We come to this situation every handful of years. It's never happened before. At the moment, the Republican side and the Biden side are very, very far apart on what needs to be done to get agreement in the House and the Senate to raise the debt ceiling. My bet is that once again, and I've covered at least 2 of these in the last 20 years, at least 2, maybe more, we will come down to whatever the X date is, whatever it turns out to be, sometime in June maybe now, we'll come down to the eve, the midnight hour before that date, before they come to an agreement.
Yeah, that is our correspondent John Terrace in New York. Thank you, as always.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, Sudan's warring factions agree to a new 7-day ceasefire as the United Nations warns of a humanitarian catastrophe on the ground.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos and unicorn companies. Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliet Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. Sudan's warring parties have agreed on a 7-day ceasefire after the current one expires on the 4th of May. A statement by South Sudan's Foreign Ministry says the rivals also agreed to name representatives for peace talks.
Meanwhile, the United Nations warns continued conflict could destabilize the entire region of northeast Africa. Sudan's neighbours are bracing for an influx of tens of thousands of refugees as this conflict drags into its 3rd week. Hundreds of people have been killed and thousands injured as the 2 military groups vie for power. Neighbours, including Egypt and South Sudan, have offered to broker a peace deal. Well, our correspondent Naba Moeddin is in Madani, around 130 kilometres from Khartoum. She explained to me the difficult and heartbreaking decisions people face to stay or to leave.
The decision is really hard for anyone. For the people who are staying in the capital, Khartoum, or around the capital, like in Madani or any other state, the biggest problem right now is the services. There is water shortages and power outages, scarcity of food, medicine, collapse of health system, and of course, above all, is the security situation for the people in Khartoum. There is looting, armed groups. Besides the armed conflict, there is lack of police, there is absence of law and order, so it's really difficult for them. But for people who chose to stay in Khartoum, some of them can't leave the capital for their own reasons, including the unsafe route from Khartoum to other places like to Egypt or to Al Jazeera. Some of them, they can't afford the cost of moving from Khartoum. Right now it's hundreds of dollars in order to leave the capital itself. One person should at least pay $500 to $1,000, which is really high for Sudanese people. For people who are staying also, the obvious scenarios of what will happen next, beside the scarcity of food, water, medicine, the extension of the war spot, if it morphed into civil war or tribal clashes. So the scenarios are open, and it's really hard to make decision about leaving the country or staying in the country.
And I think we can show you now some of the latest evacuation pictures of Chinese citizens leaving Sudan, something like 140 passengers. All Chinese students or staff from Chinese companies on a 10-hour flight via Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and this is the second chartered flight organized by Beijing.
Now, Egyptian Foreign Minister Sameh Shoukry has been meeting with an envoy for Sudan's army chief. Dafala El-Haj Ali is visiting Cairo to discuss the crisis as fighting between the Sudanese army and the paramilitary RSF group continues. Egypt says 40,000 Sudanese have crossed its borders since fighting broke out last month. And our correspondent Adel El-Marouki is in Cairo. Adel, so Egypt says its foreign ministers has been talking about regional and international counterparts in a bid to broker another ceasefire.
Yes, Egypt has never saved an effort since the crisis began to try and help in stabilizing its southern neighbor. Egypt is a country with all its land territories are facing conflicts. In the west, there is Libya, South Sudan, and the northeast, the land borders with the Palestinian Gaza Strip. So more volatility on the Egyptian border is something definitely Cairo wants to avoid. And it has been communicating with all regional and international powers to try and help in brokering a ceasefire and help the two parties to sit on the negotiating table and find a way out of this crisis. And because of that, Cairo has been intensifying its cooperation with the UAE, Saudi Arabia, South Sudan, parties that are involved and have good relations with both sides, the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary rapid support force. Now, this comes also as Cairo today hosted the Sudanese armed forces envoy, through which Cairo insisted on the importance to reach a non-conditional ceasefire. Cairo also said that this issue should be resolved with Sudanese efforts. There are expected talks to be held in Saudi Arabia between both parties after the Sudanese Foreign Ministry said that both the army and the RSF agreed to sit and negotiate in Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia will be nothing more than a hosting area, but the talks inside should be, and as planned, will be led by Sudanese parties to get a Sudan solution for this crisis.
Well, Adel, trade between Egypt and Sudan is at a standstill, and thousands of Sudanese citizens are fleeing to their northern neighbors. So how is the crisis affecting Egypt?
It has been, the trade between Sudan and Egypt has come to a complete standstill. And this is a massive $1.4 billion trade volume that was recorded and reported in 2022. This year, it was expected to go even further. And the trade between Egypt and Sudan is not just confined to the bilateral economic relations, but also Sudan for Egypt is a gateway to African countries, sharing borders with Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, DRC, Chad, and Central African Republic. Egypt had access to numerous countries into the heart of the African mainland, through which the infrastructure of roads in Sudan helped Egypt reach its goods out there. The first quarter for Egypt this year reported a $2.1 billion in exports to African countries, and the country was on a road for a target of $15 billion. Now this, of course, the crisis in Sudan makes Egyptian exports find a major challenge to reach the African continent. Egypt is currently investigating ways to make its product go through the Red Sea south, escaping Sudan and reaching other African countries from there, infiltrating the continent and trying to get to the central part of the African continent as its country struggles. And in the current situation of a foreign currency crisis, Egypt cannot afford that.
Yeah, thank you very much. That is our correspondent Adel El Marouki in Cairo.
A top Ukrainian army commander says Russian forces have been ousted from some positions in the battleground city of Bakhmut.
Ukraine is still holding on to parts of the city after 10 months of fierce fighting against Russian troops and fighters from the Wagner mercenary group. The head of Wagner said his units had made incremental advances in Bakhmut.
Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Shelby Wilder, who's watching events in Kyiv. Shelby, first of all, the latest on the fighting.
Yes, well, I'll start by giving you an update on Russia's widespread strikes across Ukraine. Yesterday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that 2 people have been killed by that strike on the city of Pavlograd in the Dnipro region. In eastern Ukraine, we know that 40 civilians were also wounded, including children. In the early hours of Monday morning, Russia launched 18 missiles across Ukraine. Ukraine's air defense managed to intercept 15 of those. But that was the second attempted strike on Kyiv, the nation's capital, within 3 days. Other news we've been following from the front lines. Ukraine's military says it will not give up the embattled city of Bakhmut in the Donetsk region in the east of Ukraine. Today, the general of Ukraine's ground forces visited Bakhmut and vowed to hold on as Ukraine prepares to launch its counteroffensive. He also said that in the meantime, Ukraine would continue to inflict maximum damage and losses on Russia's military, but also on the private military group, Wagner.
United States intelligence has given something of an insight into what it says are the extent of Russian casualties.
Yes, well, we have heard from the U.S. this week stating that they believe Russia, since December, has accumulated 100,000 casualties with its soldiers. Now, this came from White House spokesperson John Kirby. They said they believe that Russia's winter offensive, in their eyes, had essentially failed. But he added that Russia had suffered 20,000 deaths with its soldiers and 80,000 wounded just within the last 5 months. Now, Kirby added that over half of these deaths were attributed to the private military group Wagner, which has reportedly sent in its mercenaries without training or leadership at many times. And the U.S. also said that the majority of these casualties had been sustained around Bakhmut in the Donetsk region, where we know extremely fierce and bloody battles have been raging there for months, such as trench warfare, street fighting, close-range combat. And Russia, along with the Wagner private military group, continues to claim that they are on the brink of capturing that city. But with the visit today from Ukrainian military officials to Bakhmut, it shows that Ukraine's military is still holding on to that symbolic city and really now just trying to hold their ground as they await Ukraine to launch its counteroffensive. That's the latest from me here on the ground in Kyiv.
Shelby, thank you for that. Our correspondent Shelby Wilder in Ukraine.
The Kremlin has rejected that U.S. assessment of Russian military casualties as having been, I'm quoting, plucked from thin air, but offers no updates on its own figures. Meanwhile, Russia's defense minister has called for high-precision missile output to be doubled as soon as possible. Sergei Shoigu said defense enterprises have been told to rapidly increase production. He went on to say that weapons production and arms supply to the front line is crucial to military success for Moscow.
Meanwhile, a top United Nations trade official is expected to travel to Moscow amid a diplomatic push to ensure a deal is renewed, allowing for the safe export of Ukrainian grain from Black Sea ports. Talks are reportedly scheduled for Wednesday. Russia has repeatedly said it will not allow the deal to continue beyond the 18th of May unless the West removes obstacles to Russian grain and fertilizer exports.
Bulgaria says it's seeing a sharp increase in the number of migrants illegally crossing the border with Turkey. The Balkan country, an EU member, is considered to be the gateway to Europe for many migrants from Middle Eastern countries.
Tensions are at an all-time high, with authorities cracking down on the people smugglers. Our correspondent Pablo Guterres reports.
Along the fence separating Bulgaria from Turkey, border guards often intercept migrants, crushing their hopes of claiming asylum in the country. A local aid group has now filed a series of lawsuits against the Bulgarian government, claiming border guards are using violent tactics.
The guards took us to a military facility inside Bulgaria, about 3 kilometers from the border checkpoint. Once we arrived, they pulled us out of the cars and beat us.
This Syrian migrant is one of many men and women now seeking justice. Their attorneys asked us not to publish their names or show their faces for fear of retaliation.
These are vulnerable people. They are running from authorities that have been abusive. They have passed through an experience of authority in that safe country that has been abusive towards them. They have to have the courage to stand up and to speak again in front of another authority.
The group says some of the alleged abuse took place near the border or at refugee camps set up inside Bulgaria.
At the camp, they told us to take everything out of our pockets, phones, money, everything. Then they opened their patrol cars and threw their dogs at us.
Neither the Bulgarian government or the border police would comment about these allegations, citing its policy not to make public statements on pending legal cases. The government said it's committed to protecting Bulgaria and European borders. It added that since January 2022, it has reported or prevented the entrance of more than 160,000 migrants, more than 3 times the number of people that were pushed back during 2021.
Just this statement by itself is controversial, because preventing someone to enter in the country who is from Syria, from Afghanistan, the statistics show that majority of these people are not from Morocco, not from Tunis, the way that it is in Spain, in Italy. But preventing them to come in the country means you're preventing them from having access to a territory and access to asylum procedure.
In March, the European Commission launched 2 pilot programs to enhance surveillance at the Turkish border by deploying more vehicle patrols, cameras, and watchtowers. The Commission also said it would accelerate asylum procedures. Human rights groups are concerned about a growing problem that's reported at refugee camps like this one. On arrival, instead of being registered to begin their asylum claim, refugees are being detained and even deported. Stricter border enforcement means human traffickers are taking more dangerous risks to bring people into the country. Last February, 34 migrants were stuck into a cargo truck transporting timber. 18 died from suffocation. Among them were 5 children.
It's difficult. We have suffered. We thought we were coming to a safe place, that they would care for us as refugees, but we were wrong.
The migrant's lawyer says she expects an uphill battle in court. Nonetheless, she says she hopes justice will eventually prevail. Pablo Gutierrez, CGTN, Sofia, Bulgaria.
A Palestinian man has died in Israeli custody after an 87-day hunger strike. Qadir Adnan, a senior leader of the Islamic Jihad group, has been awaiting trial on terrorism charges. Israeli authorities say Adnan was found unconscious in his cell and declared dead after efforts to revive him failed. Israel maintains Adnan has refused medical treatment, although his lawyer says care was withheld. Adnan is the first Palestinian to die on hunger strike since 1992.
The self-proclaimed Kenyan pastor Paul Mackenzie has appeared in court accused of inciting cult followers to starve to death in order to meet Jesus. Mackenzie faces charges including murder, kidnapping and cruelty to children following the deaths of more than 100 people. Their bodies, showing signs of starvation and asphyxiation, were found in around 30 shallow graves on his land, where research is continuing.
A 69-year-old American climber has died after falling ill at a camp on Mount Chomolungma, also known as Mount Everest. It's the fourth fatality this season. 3 Nepali mountaineers died last month after a block of ice fell and swept them into a crevasse. A record number of climbers are expected to attempt the world's tallest peak in the coming weeks, raising concerns about overcrowding.
Nearly 300 people were arrested and dozens of police officers injured after rioting broke out during May Day protests in France. Many French people opposed the government's pension reform, and hundreds of thousands of demonstrators took to the streets to vent their anger after President Macron raised the retirement age from 62 to 64, despite months of strikes.
You can get highlights from the week's news in Europe and China direct to your inbox from CGTN Storyboards email newsletter. Sign up at europe.cgtn.com/newsletter.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, there's nothing on the telly. Hollywood screenwriters go on strike, threatening to bring television and film production to a standstill.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, in the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Li Jianhua. Our top stories. Sounding the alarm on artificial intelligence, Google's godfather of AI warns the technology is moving ahead too fast and will soon be smarter than humans. And the U.S. Treasury Secretary warns the country could run out of money in a month if it can't reach a deal of the debt ceiling.
Hollywood film and television writers are set to go on strike for the first time in 15 years. The Writers Guild of America is seeking pay increases from large studios and production companies like Netflix and Disney. The writers say they've suffered financially during the streaming TV boom. Half of all TV series writers now work at minimum salary levels, compared with a third 10 years ago. The current minimum for a TV writer-producer is reported to be around $7,400 per week. Well, the median salary for higher-level writers and producers has also fallen by around 4% over the last decade. And the last time there was a similar strike action, nearly 40,000 jobs were lost. And the shutdown lasted 100 days. Popular programs such as Breaking Bad had to finish their series early, and many other series were cancelled. As productions shut down and out-of-work writers cut back on their spending, the last strike cost the state of California $2.1 billion, tipping its economy into a recession. Well, let's talk to Brian Steinberg, senior TV editor at Variety magazine. Brian, lovely to see you. I mean, in real terms, for those of us who just watch the telly, what does this mean?
Basically, it means that in a couple of weeks, if things don't change, what you can watch is going to change quite a bit. That's live TV. You know, of course, this is the era of streaming, and there are always, older shows that are available. But in terms of new scripted content, that's going to become a trickle rather than a stream in a little while.
Okay, so that's the story of the viewer's experience. What's the knock-on effect going to be in the industry if this is a protracted strike?
Yeah, this puts people out of work. Already, America's late-night shows have gone dark, gone to repeats. That's, camera crews and stage studio crews who aren't going to be, working daily. So what the trickle effect is people who work in Hollywood and in TV and movies on sets who cater to those things suddenly find that there's no live production going on.
I mean, Brian, it's a bit difficult for comparative analysis here, but $7,400 per week, frankly, sounds like we're all in the wrong job. I mean, don't they earn enough already?
It's been problematic. What's going on, there are two sides. On one side, the writers who find themselves having to jump a lot more to different shows. There are fewer episodes per show. You see on Netflix and Amazon, these series have 8, 10, 12 episodes per cycle versus the 20s. That used to be the norm for television. On the other side, the big media companies, Paramount, Disney, NBC, are under tremendous pressure by Wall Street to show profitability as they start spending billions of dollars in streaming content.
We were reporting on artificial intelligence at the very top of the show. I wonder if AI is going to impact the industry, and presumably you can fire up an AI scriptwriter and they don't go on strike.
Well, there is some talk about AI in the terms of discussion right now. I think writers are concerned, and perhaps rightfully so, that the research can be done, of surveying how do these things work, what makes things real, what are the real verite details of a certain scene or a story, can be done by a chatbot or a chat AI thing, and that is a valid concern right now. Technology is usually at the heart of these disputes. Every few years, the way things are done changes, and writing and putting a show together is no different.
I remember reading stuff in your publication around about the time of the pandemic, and as we know, the pandemic caused film and television production around the world to pause. It was very difficult to get actors and film crew into sets, and there was this big pause. So the industry has recent experience of how to handle a big stoppage. I mean, does that change what's about to happen? The industry bosses have been here already recently, haven't they?
Well, they know how to fill their schedule with older stuff, curated material, more sports and news, more live programming, and more reality shows. I mean, people at Food Network and HGTV spent a lot of time sending out cameras and self-production kits to their stars so they could film themselves at home. There is a playbook for it. It is not, it's not premium TV. And if you're an advertiser or a distributor, maybe you're not so big on it.
Well, you call this. Is there going to be a happy ending? How do you see this playing out? Someone's got to blink.
Someone's going to blink. There will be a coming together of the two sides, but it may take a while. Riders feel under pressure, and so too do the big media companies. No one is loving life right now. The ground on which they both sit is changing very quickly.
As my dad used to say, there's nothing on the telly, and that's about to be true by the sound of it. Brian, good to talk to you. Brian Steinberg, Senior TV Editor at Variety magazine.
The World Economic Forum has published its latest chief economist outlook and is still concerned about high inflation, sluggish growth and persistent headwinds. But there were bright spots including China's recovery and the economic resilience of India. Our correspondent Juliet Mann is at the WEF Growth Summit in Geneva.
Over the next couple of days, leaders from business, government, academia, civil society and international organisations are coming to the World Economic Forum headquarters here in Geneva to discuss and shape the future of work to be sustainable, inclusive and equitable. But don't be deceived by this bright and sunny background, because the economic background remains gloomy. Some economists say there's a continuing fog of ambiguity that clouds the economic picture. So no wonder they're still split on whether or not the world is headed for global recession.
We're in new territory. We've seen all of this Fed tightening. No one imagines, even with the market pricing in Fed rate cuts, that we're going to go back to the years of ultra-easy, ultra-accommodative policy. And we know that there was excessive borrowing in some respects, excessive risk-taking because of that ultra-accommodative policy. And now we're going to be paying the price. Some economies are going to have to try much harder to reassure on their ability to finance themselves and to keep growth going.
A range of issues continues to hinder robust economic recovery. Inflation, geopolitical tensions, bumps in banking. But the chief economists don't see that as a sign of systemic failure in financial systems, although they do expect more bumps in banking and significant disruption in other sectors, like property. Food prices are a concern, energy prices less so, and yet 76% of respondents think that the cost of living crisis is going to remain acute in most countries. The outlook's stark in Europe and the United States, but the outlier is China, where only 14% of analysts think that inflation is going to increase this year. Now, what the World Economic Forum is hoping that all of this is going to mobilise global leaders to come up with a framework for growth that focuses on sustainability, on inclusion and resilience in economic policy. Juliet Mann, CGTN, Geneva.
UK-based banking giant HSBC has posted better than expected earnings for the first quarter, boosted by worldwide interest rate increases.
Europe's biggest bank recorded a massive nearly $13 billion in pre-tax profits for the first 3 months of the year. That's up 207% on the same time last year. And Justin Coher-Stewart is the co-founder of Seven Investment Management. Stewart, great to have you on the show. So these appear to be huge profits.
These are cracking good figures indeed, and particularly compared with last year, but they have been quite lucky. First of all, they were able to pick up a bank on the cheap, but they were able to pick up Silicon Valley's UK operations for $1, $1.25, and that's actually not a bad bit of business actually over there. Then, of course, they've had interest rates rising. Of course, banks really work very badly unless you got rates getting up to about 4 or 5%, which they are getting to now. When they're at 1 or 2%, there's no margin for them. But there are going to be some other issues as well. They've got issues over property lending, and some very bad property lending, I suspect, is going to come out. And, of course, an awful lot of people borrowed money when it was 1 or 2%. Now those prices have doubled. There are going to be some bad debts coming out. But they've been in a good position.
Well, you call it not a bad bit of business. HBC, as you say, bought SVB UK for, what was it, $1.25, for goodness sake. I mean, it does seem strange, you know, as someone who's, you know, not into this world as you are, that the acquisition of a failing bank would then boost profits.
Well, basically what you're doing is taking over all those assets, and the assets themselves are actually, we don't know the quality of them, but actually the British side seem to be quite good. Most of the problems appear to be in the American operation of SVB. Now, they've also benefited, of course, the problems with Credit Suisse. Now, Credit Suisse, we discussed before, the problems there, that bank disappears, most of it goes to UBS, but it also means an awful lot of other clients will be looking for other places to have their money looked after. Where else do you go to? Well, one of the obvious ones is going to be HSBC. So they've been in the right place at the right time to be able to do this. But, of course, what they have got is making sure they keep their shareholders happy, and that's been the problem over the past few years, because they've got some rather fussy shareholders actually thinking they should be doing something to actually give them more return for their money.
And HSBC is facing big pressure from shareholders in China who want their banks a much more profitable Asia business to break away from the UK. Will that happen?
Well, Ping An, the insurance company there, has put a lot of investment into HSBC, but really much at the wrong time. The banking industry was going through a difficult time. But you can quite understand it. And the clue's in the name. Hong Kong, Shanghai, not much mention of London there. But, of course, it is, because of what's happened over the past few years, it ends up as Europe's largest bank. But it's inevitable you're going to see more concentration, because traditionally, actually, they made a lot of their solid profits in the Far East over the years. I wouldn't be at all surprised in time to come if you do actually see some sort of split. But in the meantime, what they're doing is doing share buybacks. By buying back the shares, you're decreasing the number of shares, therefore actually spreading the value over a smaller number, therefore putting the share price up. They're now bringing back the quarterly dividend, which we haven't seen for some time. So everything to try and keep the shareholders happy. And with figures like that, not many shareholders are going to be unhappy with that, but watch out. I suspect there's still going to be more pressure to give it actually more local focus in the Far East.
Can we just pick up on the buyback? Because HSBC says it would buy back $2 billion of shares. I mean, just explain how that's going to help the bank.
Well, what you're doing, if you're actually giving money back to shareholders, you can give them a dividend. That's fine, that's perfectly right, the money goes out. Or what you can do, buy more shares back. Therefore, there are less number of shares available, but the value of the bank effectively still stays roughly the same. So you've still got the same bank, but owned by fewer shares. So the shares are now worth more. And so as the value increases, smaller number of shares will be worth more. So for shareholders who wish to actually save for the longer term, that should provide greater value for them.
Justin, good to see you. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. Justin Urquhart-Stewart, co-founder of 7 Investment Management. Hong Kong's economy saw a return to growth in the first quarter of the year following the easing of COVID restrictions. The region is seeing a steady inflow of tourists from the Chinese mainland. Our correspondent Richard Kimber reports.
There's certainly a lot of optimism here right now after what's been a difficult 3 years. There were more than 300,000 visitors from the Chinese mainland coming to Hong Kong on the first of the Labor Day holidays, and that trend has continued in the 2 or 3 days since the Labor Day holiday began. I was out in the middle of the city all day yesterday, and it was really heaving with tourists and with business activity, and that's been reflected in the latest GDP figures released here in Hong Kong this morning for the first quarter, a growth of 2.7%. That's way beyond what economists were expecting here. They were looking at around 0.5 percentage gain for the first quarter. That's largely been due to the influx of tourists from the Chinese mainland driving consumption here. The retail sales in February were the fastest in a decade here in Hong Kong as a result largely of an influx of tourists from the Chinese mainland coming over during the Lunar New Year holidays. That influx, as I say, continued during these Labor Day holidays, and it's really providing the rocket fuel, if you like, that Hong Kong really needs to get its economy back on track.
That is our correspondent Richard Kimber in Hong Kong. And you're watching CGTN Still Ahead. Long to reign over us, why the coronation of King Charles might make some uncomfortable reading for royalists.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew. And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. Large cruise liners are regarded as one of the most challenging vessels to build because of their complexity and high standards.
After 3 years of construction, China's first homegrown cruise liner is scheduled for delivery this year. Our reporter Wu Bin has been on board following an engineer working on final fit-outs before sailing.
This is Adora, China's first domestically built cruise liner. Weighing over 130,000 tons, it's the largest passenger vessel that China ever built. Now, it's sitting quietly in the northeast tip of Shanghai and almost ready to sail. Enormous efforts has gone into the construction of the ship. The liner has 25 million components, double the number needed for building an aircraft carrier. Ma Ling is one of the few female engineers in China's shipbuilding industry. She and her team are now working on the testing of the ship to make sure every function is running normally when sailing in the ocean. But as someone who's been working in this industry for over 20 years, to make this ship alive is nothing like any previous vessels.
然后这条船的这种安全的点是3万多个，那你这个点是要一个一个的做，而且差不多要做3遍。
In the past, we may only need 30 to 60 people to do the testing job. But for this ship, we still feel a bit short-handed, even if we have 300 people.
What's making the testing job so difficult is not only the size, but also the high standards for both comfort and energy efficiency. For example, the air conditioning will automatically stop once you open the door to the balcony.
所以他认为你那个时候你享受海风了，那我不给你供空调了。 来保证我这个船的这个绿色低耗。
Now the ship is about to be delivered this year, and the final preparations are in full swing. The factory has an average of 3,500 workers on the ship per day.
At the beginning of June, the ship will leave the dock, which is a key stage. Then we will conduct a mooring test for about 1.5 months, mainly for a first trial in mid or late July. And then there will be a second trial run afterwards.
For the entire team, the days during the trial run will be sleepless, but they all look forward to the day when Adora sails the oceans.
It's such a large ship. By the time it leaves the dock, sails on the Yangtze River, and finally goes out to the high seas. And if there are other ships passing by, it will be a very spectacular scene.
To all the workers who have been dedicated to the first cruise liner, the construction has provided a lot of experience, making the entire industry chain more complete. And now, China's second cruise liner is also on its way. Wu Bin, CGTN, Shanghai.
6 people have been killed and more than 24 injured in a mass car pileup in the United States state of Illinois. A severe dust storm reduced visibility to almost zero, causing dozens of vehicles to crash on a highway. More than 30 people were taken to hospitals in the area. The police say their injuries range from minor to life-threatening.
Japan is introducing its first laws against taking sexually exploitative photos or videos of others without consent. The bill, which is expected to be passed in June, will prohibit upskirting and secret filming of sexual acts. It is part of a wider overhaul of Japan's laws on sex crimes, which will also expand the definition of rape.
Australia has announced a ban on recreational vaping as it tries to stem nicotine addiction among teenagers. The new rules include the introduction of minimum quality standards and also restricting vape sales to pharmacies. This move is seen as part of the wider crackdown on the tobacco industry.
With the coronation of King Charles III just days away, the annual British Attitude Survey shows that support for the monarchy is at an all-time low.
A majority still believe the monarchy is important, but a quarter of the population surveyed wanted to see it abolished. CGTN's correspondent Michael Voss looks at royal finances and whether they offer good value for money.
This week's coronation of King Charles III will cost around $125 million. Some die-hard fans are already camping out there to get the best view.
Quality of the King and keep continuing the good work, sir, and the whole the country's behind you.
But following the death of Queen Elizabeth, anti-monarchists are becoming more vocal.
Yeah, I think the monarchy's in a lot of trouble because they've lost their star player. Support is clearly going down. Interest is going down, and that's a big problem for them.
Part of the argument is about costs and whether they represent good value for money. Every year, the government provides what's called a sovereign grant to cover the costs of royal duties and upkeep. Last year, the royal family cost the taxpayer around $130 million. Most of that went on maintaining and renovating the palaces. The payroll also runs at about $30 million a year, while royal travel cost another $6 million. But there are many other unpublished costs, including security, policing and local authority costs of royal visits. Some estimate the real total cost of the royal family could be as high as $500 million a year. King Charles inherited vast estates from his mother. Forbes magazine estimates he controls around $42 billion in assets, including palaces, property, art collections and jewels. But he can't sell them, and the $400 million income from the Crown Estate property portfolio goes to the government. There are no official figures for the impact of the royal family on the British economy. But with millions of tourists visiting Britain each year, the pomp and pageantry of royalty is one of the draws. The only published research was by Brand Finance back in 2017, which said the monarchy brought in some $3 billion in tourist revenues. According to the palace, visitors spent $85 million on admission charges to royal palaces and a further $24 million on royal collection gift shops. It's hard to put a value on the soft power of royal overseas tours and hosting heads of state at Buckingham Palace. King Charles has said that in these tough economic times he needs to cut costs and plans to reduce the size of the monarchy. But the debate over value for money isn't about to go away. Michael Voss, CGTN.
The headlines again, sounding the alarm on artificial intelligence. Google's godfather of AI warns that technology is moving ahead too fast and will soon be smarter than humans.
Our other headlines, money in the bank. HSBC profits triple as higher interest rates lift earnings.
And real-life Hollywood drama starring the striking scriptwriters in a nail-biting storyline threatening to bring TV and film production to a halt.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
More on our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
And you can go to CGTN Europe's channel on the Telegram app or scan the QR code on the screen to get stories and updates sent direct to your phone.
Coming up next on CGTN Africa Live. See you again tomorrow, same time, same place. For now, from all the team in London, that's goodbye.
Goodbye.